The old van rattled as it rolled over the uneven road. The group of 5, Mia, Ethan, Jack, Clara, and Ben, were on a road trip, escaping the monotony of city life. They had no destination, just a map with backroads and a thirst for adventure. The late afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dense forest that lined both sides of the road. "Are we sure we're not lost?" Clara asked, her voice laced with irritation. She sat in the back, leaning against the window with crossed arms. "Relax," Jack said, gripping the steering wheel. "The map says there's a town up ahead. We'll stop there for the night." Mia leaned forward from the passenger seat, squinting at the map. "Stillwater," she read aloud. "Population? Doesn't say. But it's on the map, so it has to be there." "Great," Ben muttered. "I just hope it has food. I'm starving." As they rounded the next bend, the forest opened up, revealing a small, quiet town nestled in a valley. The sign at the entrance was weathered and faded, but the word Stillwater was just legible. The place looked like it hadn't changed in decades. Narrow streets lined with old brick buildings stretched out before them. The air was eerily still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. Jack slowed the van to a crawl. "Where's everyone?" he asked, scanning the empty sidewalks. "Maybe it's one of those ghost towns," Clara suggested, only half joking. "No way," Ethan replied. "Look at the buildings. They're in good shape. It's like everyone just up and left." Jack parked the van in front of what appeared to be a diner. Its neon sign flickered weakly. "Stillwater Diner. Open 24 hours. "Well, let's check it out," Mia said, opening the door. The others hesitated before following her. The air outside was colder than expected, carrying a strange metallic tang. They approached the diner cautiously. Through the windows, they could see tables and chairs neatly arranged, as if waiting for customers. The lights were on, but there was no movement inside. Jack pushed the door open, and a small bell jingled overhead. "Hello," Mia called out. Her voice echoed in the empty space. The group stepped inside, their footsteps muffled by the checkered linoleum floor. Everything looked pristine, no dust, no signs of abandonment. Plates of food sat on tables, untouched but perfectly preserved. A cup of coffee steamed faintly on the counter, as if it had just been poured. "This is seriously creepy," Clara whispered. Ethan picked up a fork from one of the tables. The food looked fresh, but something about it felt wrong. "It's like they all vanished in the middle of eating," he said. A low creak echoed through the diner, and everyone froze. Jack spun around, eyes darting toward the source of the sound. "Did you hear that?" "It came from the kitchen," Ben whispered. Mia took a hesitant step toward the counter, peeking into the kitchen through the swinging door. The dim light revealed spotless counters and shiny appliances, but there was no one there. "Maybe we should leave," Clara suggested, backing toward the door. "Not yet," Jack said, his curiosity getting the better of him. "We need to figure out what's going on." Ethan walked to a bulletin board near the counter. Newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and a calendar were pinned to it. The calendar was marked with events, farmers markets, town meetings, but all the dates stopped abruptly 2 weeks ago. "Guys," he said, pointing at the calendar. "Whatever happened here, it wasn't long ago." Suddenly, the jukebox in the corner crackled to life. An old song began to play, its cheerful melody jarring against the unsettling atmosphere. Everyone turned to look at it, their faces pale. "Nope, nope, nope," Clara said, grabbing Ben's arm. "We're leaving." As they hurried out of the diner, the jukebox abruptly cut off, plunging the town back into silence. Outside, the sky was darker now, and a thick mist had begun to creep through the streets. The van was still where they had left it, but something about it looked off. "Did we leave the headlights on?" Jack asked. "No," Mia said firmly. The group approached the van cautiously. The headlights were indeed on, but the keys were still in Jack's pocket. "Okay, this is getting way too weird," Clara said, her voice shaking. Without warning, a shadow flickered across the edge of their vision, darting between two buildings. "Did you see that?" Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. "See what?" Mia replied, her eyes scanning the darkness. Before anyone could answer, the sound of faint footsteps echoed through the mist, growing louder with each passing second. The group huddled together, their breaths visible in the cold night air. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice cracking slightly. No response. The footsteps stopped, leaving an oppressive silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the mist, came a chilling whisper. "You shouldn't have come." The whisper lingered in the air, chilling and sharp. The group stood frozen, staring into the swirling mist that had now enveloped the entire street. Jack tightened his grip on the van's keys, his knuckles white. "Let's just get in the van and leave," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Jack nodded and reached for the driver's door. But as his hand touched the handle, the headlights blinked off, leaving them in near darkness. The mist seemed thicker now, pressing in around them like a living thing. "Everyone, get in," Jack urged, yanking the door open. The others scrambled to climb in, their breaths shallow and panicked. Mia slid into the passenger seat, while Ben, Clara, and Ethan crammed into the back. Jack turned the key, but instead of the reassuring rumble of the engine, there was only a hollow click. He tried again. Click. "No, no, no," Jack muttered, twisting the key repeatedly. The van refused to start. "This can't be happening," Clara said, her voice rising. "We have to get out of here." "Calm down," Mia said, though her own voice wavered. She turned to Jack. "What's wrong with it?" "I don't know," Jack snapped, slamming his fist on the steering wheel. "It was fine a minute ago." A sudden thud jolted the van. It felt as if something or someone had slammed against the back. Everyone fell silent, their eyes darting to the rear window. "Did you feel that?" Ethan whispered. Another thud, louder this time. Then came the sound of scratching, like nails dragging across the metal exterior. "What is that?" Ben asked, his voice barely audible. "Stay inside," Jack said, though his own fear was evident. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a flashlight. "I'll check it out." "Are you crazy?" Mia hissed. "You can't go out there." "We need to know what's happening," Jack said firmly. He opened the door and stepped out into the mist, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The others watched anxiously as Jack circled to the back of the van. He shone the light on the rear door but saw nothing unusual. The scratching had stopped, leaving only the eerie silence. "See anything?" Mia called out, her voice tight. Jack shook his head. "Nothing," but as he turned to walk back to the driver's side, he caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye. The flashlight's beam swept across the edge of the mist, revealing a dark figure standing motionless about 10 feet away. "Hello," Jack called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't move. It was tall, its features obscured by the dense fog. "Jack, get back in the van," Mia shouted. The figure took a step forward, and Jack stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. Without waiting to see more, he bolted for the van and slammed the door behind him. "Drive!" Clara screamed. "I told you, it won't start," Jack yelled back, frantically turning the key again. The van remained stubbornly silent. "They're getting closer," Ethan said, his eyes wide as he stared out the window. More shadows had appeared in the mist, moving slowly but deliberately toward the vehicle. What do we do? Mia asked, her voice cracking. Jack gritted his teeth. We run. We can't stay here. Run where? Clara demanded. We don't even know what's out there. Do you want to wait and find out? Jack snapped. The group exchanged panicked glances before reluctantly agreeing. They grabbed their phones and backpacks, though the signal bars on their screens remained stubbornly empty. Stick together, Jack said as they climbed out of the van. The mist was colder now, wrapping around them like icy tendrils. The group moved quickly, their footsteps crunching on the gravel road. The dark figures remained just at the edge of their vision, never rushing but always following. This way, Jack said, leading them toward the faint outline of a building. It looked like an old motel, its windows dark and uninviting. You think we'll be safer in there? Ben asked, hesitating. It's better than staying out here, Jack said. He pushed open the creaking door, and they stepped into the musty lobby. The room smelled of mildew and decay. A dusty reception desk sat at the far end, with a tarnished bell resting on the counter. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floorboards groaned under their weight. Let's just stay here until morning, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded. Barricade the door. The group moved quickly, dragging an old couch and a few chairs to block the entrance. They huddled together in the center of the room, their backs to each other. Does anyone have a signal yet? Mia asked, holding up her phone. The screen was still blank. What is this place? Ethan murmured, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. It's like the whole town is stuck in time, Mia said. Did you see the diner? It was like everyone just disappeared. But everything stayed perfect. And those things outside, Ben added. They're not human. They can't be. We don't know that, Jack said, though he didn't sound convinced. A sudden knock at the door made everyone jump. It was a slow, deliberate knock, followed by a voice that sent shivers down their spines. Let us in, it whispered. The voice was soft but unnatural, echoing as if it came from everywhere at once. Don't answer it, Mia said, her eyes wide. The knocking continued, growing louder and more frantic. Let us in, the voice demanded, now deep and guttural. The barricade shook as if something was pounding against it. We can't stay here, Jack said, pulling Mia to her feet. We need to find another way out. There's a door in the back, Ethan said, pointing toward a dark hallway. The group moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the empty motel. The pounding at the front door grew more violent, and the walls seemed to tremble under the force. They reached the back door and shoved it open, stumbling into the cold night air. The mist was still thick, but the shadows were nowhere in sight. Which way now? Clara asked, her voice shaking. Jack scanned the area, his flashlight flickering weakly. In the distance, he spotted the faint outline of a church steeple rising above the mist. There, he said. We'll head for the church. Maybe it's safe. The group hesitated for only a moment before following him. The whispers began again, faint at first but growing louder with each step. You shouldn't have come, they hissed. You won't leave. The group trudged through the dense mist, every step muffled by the eerie stillness around them. The church steeple stood tall in the distance, its faint outline barely visible against the swirling fog. Jack led the way, his flashlight flickering in the damp air. Are we even going the right way? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It's the only thing we've seen that looks like it might be safe, Jack replied. Behind them, the whispers followed. They weren't loud, but they were constant, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the mist itself. Every now and then, one of them would glance back, half expecting to see the dark figures from before, but the shadows remained hidden. Just keep moving, Jack said. We're almost there. The closer they got to the church, the more oppressive the air became. It was heavy, almost suffocating, and smelled faintly of damp earth and decay. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they sounded like a crowd murmuring just out of sight. Finally, they reached the church. It was an old, weathered building, its wooden doors warped and cracked. The windows were dark, but the faint outline of stained glass hinted at a time when it might have been beautiful. Jack pushed on the doors, but they wouldn't budge. "Let me help," Ethan said, stepping forward. Together, they shoved until the doors groaned open, revealing the dim interior. The church was cold and silent, its pews lined up neatly despite the thick layer of dust covering everything. A large crucifix hung on the far wall, but its figure was unsettlingly distorted, as if it had melted or been warped by some unseen force. "This place doesn't feel right," Clara said, clutching Mia's arm. "Nowhere in this town feels right," Mia replied. Jack motioned for everyone to follow him. "Let's check the back rooms. There might be supplies or another way out." The group moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. As they passed the rows of pews, Clara stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Everyone froze, listening. At first, there was only silence, but then they heard it. A faint ringing, like the toll of a distant bell. It was soft, almost melodic, but there was something off about it, something that made their skin crawl. "It's coming from the tower," Ethan said, pointing to the staircase at the side of the room. "Why would a bell be ringing if the town's abandoned?" Mia asked. Jack shook his head. "I don't know, but we're not going up there. Let's stick to the ground floor." They continued toward the back of the church, finding a small door that led to a narrow hallway. The walls were lined with old paintings, their colors faded and their subjects unrecognizable. The air was even colder here, and the whispers seemed to grow louder. At the end of the hallway, they found a small office. Inside was a desk, an old chair, and a bookshelf filled with tattered books. Jack began rummaging through the desk while the others searched the room. "There's nothing useful here," Mia said, flipping through one of the books. The pages were covered in strange symbols she couldn't understand. Jack pulled open a drawer and froze. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. He opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with shaky handwriting. "What is it?" Clara asked, peering over his shoulder. "It looks like a diary," Jack said. He read aloud. "They came with the mist. First, we thought it was just a storm, but then the disappearances began. People would vanish without a trace, their homes left untouched. We tried to leave, but the roads lead only back to the town. The bell rings for the lost. Do not answer it. Do not look at them. Pray for morning, though it never comes." The group stared at him, the weight of the words sinking in. "What does it mean, the bell rings for the lost?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. Before Jack could answer, the bell rang again. This time, it was louder, echoing through the church with a hollow, mournful tone. "We need to get out of here," Clara said. Her voice panicked. "This place isn't safe." As if in response, the whispers grew louder, filling the air like a swarm of unseen insects. The group huddled together, their fear palpable. "Wait," Mia said suddenly. "Do you hear that?" The others fell silent. Beneath the whispers and the bell, there was another sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the main hall. "They're inside," Ethan whispered, his face pale. Jack motioned for everyone to stay quiet. He turned off his flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. The group held their breath as the footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the office door. The handle turned slowly, the sound deafening in the silence. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness on the other side. And then a figure stepped in, It was one of the shadows they had seen earlier, its form barely human. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its head tilting as if it were sniffing the air. "Don't move," Jack whispered, barely audible. The figure took another step into the room, its black, featureless face turning toward them. It made no sound, but the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Suddenly, the bell rang again, and the figure stopped. It stood still for a moment before turning and walking out of the room, its movements as unnatural as before. The group didn't move until the whispers faded and the sound of footsteps disappeared. "We have to leave," Mia said, her voice shaking. "Now?" Jack nodded. "Back to the van. We'll figure something out." They crept out of the office, their movements slow and deliberate. The main hall was empty, but the air felt heavier than before. The bell rang again, its mournful tone filling the space. As they stepped outside, the mist seemed thicker, almost alive. The shadows were back, standing motionless in the distance, their forms barely visible. "Run," Jack said, and the group took off, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The shadows didn't move at first, but as the group got closer to the van, they began to follow, their jerky movements eerily fast. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic, as if the shadows were speaking directly into their minds. "Get in," Jack shouted as they reached the van. He yanked the driver's door open and tried the key again. This time, the engine roared to life. "Go, go, go!" Mia screamed as the others piled in. Jack slammed the accelerator, and the van lurched forward, speeding down the empty road. The shadows faded into the mist, but the whispers lingered, haunting and relentless. As the van raced away, the group sat in silence, their breaths ragged and their minds racing. The church, the shadows, the bell. It all felt like a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. But the road ahead was still shrouded in mist, and the whispers followed them, growing louder with each passing mile. The van sped through the mist, the tires humming against the road, but the mist seemed to grow thicker, as if it were closing in on them. Every time Jack glanced in the rearview mirror, he half expected to see the shadows following them, but there was nothing, just darkness. Clara gripped the seat, her knuckles white. "What the hell was that thing back at the church?" "I don't know," Jack muttered, his grip tight on the steering wheel. "But we're getting out of here. We have to get to the next town." "There is no next town," Mia said from the back. Her voice was barely audible over the hum of the engine. "It's just more of this." The van seemed to roll through an endless sea of fog. No landmarks, no signs. Just the road stretching forward, like a river that had no end. The clock on the dashboard read 2:43 a.m. Felt like they'd been driving for hours, but it also felt like no time had passed at all. "Something's wrong," Clara whispered, as if she were afraid to say it out loud. "We've been on the same road for hours." Jack didn't answer. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, but the dread in his gut told him Clara was right. The road hadn't changed. It was like they were trapped in some twisted loop, one that wouldn't let them escape. "We're going in circles," Ben said suddenly, his voice tight with panic. "Look at the road signs. They all say the same thing." Jack slammed his foot on the brakes. The van screeched to a halt, and the headlights illuminated the sign ahead. It was the same as the last one. "Welcome to Hollow Creek." "Are we back?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "No," Jack muttered, his eyes scanning the sign. "That's impossible. We didn't pass this place. We're not back. Something's wrong." They all stared at the sign, unable to look away. The name Hollow Creek seemed to glow in the dim light, almost mocking them. The van's engine sputtered and then stopped, plunging them into silence. Jack cursed under his breath, turning the key in the ignition. It wouldn't start. He tried again, but the engine refused to turn over. "We're stuck," he said, his voice shaking with frustration. Clara pulled her knees up to her chest, staring out of the window. "I don't like this. It's like the town's alive, watching us. We need to get out of here," Ben said, his voice desperate. "This whole place is cursed." "Don't say that," Mia snapped, her voice sharp. "We need to stay calm. There's a way out of this. There has to be." Jack rubbed his temples, trying to think. He opened the door, stepping out into the fog. The cold air hit him like a slap in the face, but he barely felt it. His thoughts were racing. "We can't just sit here," he said. "We need to find help." But as soon as he stepped away from the van, the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, as if the earth itself were moving. He stumbled, catching himself on the side of the van. "Jack!" Clara called from inside, her voice full of panic. He didn't answer. He felt something pulling him, an invisible force that tugged at him like a thread. The whispers were back, louder than before. He could hear them now, faint but unmistakable, coming from all directions. They were calling to him, urging him forward. "Jack, get back in the van!" Clara screamed. "Please!" But Jack didn't move. His feet carried him forward, down the fog-choked road. He didn't know why. Felt like he had no choice. He had to go. He had to see what was at the end of this road. The others were shouting his name, but he couldn't hear them anymore. The whispers drowned out everything else. They were all around him now, too close, too real. He could almost feel them brushing against his skin. The fog seemed to part just ahead of him, revealing a small, dilapidated house. The lights were on inside, and the door was slightly ajar. Something about it felt familiar. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't remember how he knew it, but he felt drawn to it. The house was waiting for him. He stepped up to the door, pushing it open. The hinges creaked in protest, the sound too loud in the stillness. Inside, the house was dark, save for a single light in the living room. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dust and something else. Something rotten. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor, and the door slammed shut behind him. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. A chair that looked like it had been there for years, covered in layers of dust. Jack couldn't tear his eyes away from it. It was as if the chair were waiting for him. And then, as if on cue, the door opened again. The figure from the church stepped inside. It was the same twisted thing, its face still dark and featureless, its body jerking unnaturally with each movement. Jack froze. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His heart raced in his chest, pounding against his ribs. The figure stepped closer, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. It raised a hand, no, a claw, and pointed at the chair. "Sit." Jack's body obeyed before he could stop it. His legs moved on their own, carrying him toward the chair. He sat down, the cold wood biting into his skin. The figure stood still for a moment, its dark shape looming over him. And then, as if it had never been there, the figure disappeared into the shadows. The room fell silent. The whispers, the figures, everything vanished. Jack blinked, and he was back in the van, his heart still racing. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. The others were staring at him, wide-eyed and confused. "What the hell happened?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. Jack couldn't answer. He didn't know. Had it all been a dream, or had the town pulled him in somehow? "We need to leave," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "Now?" But as he put the van into gear, he looked up and saw it. The church, standing on the hill just beyond the fog. The bell rang again, its hollow sound filling the air, and they were back, trapped in Hollow Creek. The van jerked forward, its tires skidding against the slick road as Jack slammed the gas pedal. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely grip the wheel. He tried to focus, but the feeling of the chair, the figure in the house, it all haunted him. He couldn't shake the image of that thing pointing at him. The others were silent, all of them still processing what had just happened. Clara stared out the window, her face pale, her lips pressed together in a tight line. Ben was hunched over, his arms wrapped around his chest as if he could protect himself from something invisible. Mia looked like she was on the verge of tears, but she said nothing. None of them spoke for what felt like hours, as if they were all waiting for the fog to lift, for the nightmare to end. But it didn't. It only seemed to grow thicker. And the road never changed. Jack tried to keep his focus, but the feeling of being trapped was suffocating. The fog pressed in on them like a living thing, curling around the van, blocking out everything but the path ahead. The same road, the same signs, the same town, Hollow Creek. "We're stuck," Ben muttered, his voice breaking the silence. "We're never going to get out." Jack slammed his fist against the steering wheel in frustration. "There's got to be a way out. We can't be stuck here forever." Clara glanced at him, her eyes filled with fear. "It feels like we're in some kind of loop. The town, the fog. It's like it's playing with us." Mia shuddered, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. "I don't understand. How can a whole town just disappear?" Jack didn't have an answer for her. They'd already searched for any signs of life, but everything they had seen in the town, every building, every street was empty. No one had been there for what looked like years. "Maybe there's something we're missing," Jack said. His voice was low, almost to himself. He couldn't shake the feeling that the town was hiding something from them, something important. They couldn't leave until they figured it out. Suddenly, Ben's voice broke through his thoughts. "Look, ahead of them, just at the edge of the fog, the silhouette of a figure appeared on the road. It was a person standing motionless in the middle of the street, their back to the van." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He slammed the brakes again, bringing the van to a screeching halt. "Who is that?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Jack replied, his eyes locked on the figure. "But we need to find out." Slowly, he opened the van door, his breath visible in the cold air. The others hesitated, but when Jack stepped out, they followed him, moving cautiously, as if the ground itself might swallow them up. The figure remained still, its back to them, unmoving. "Hello," Jack called out, his voice shaking. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. "Maybe they're just lost," Mia suggested, but there was no conviction in her voice. Jack took a few steps forward, each one feeling heavier than the last. He was drawn to the figure, but a sense of dread gnawed at his insides. He had to know what was going on. As he got closer, the figure slowly turned around. It was a woman. Her hair was long and wild, her clothes torn and dirty. Her eyes, however, were the most unsettling thing about her. They were empty, hollow, as if there was nothing inside. "Do you need help?" Clara called, her voice louder now, but the woman didn't respond. She just stared at them, her gaze fixed on Jack. He could feel the weight of her stare, like she was looking right through him, seeing into something deep inside. I don't think she's real," Ben said, his voice shaky. "Her eyes, they don't look alive." Jack couldn't tear his gaze away. The woman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then, just as quickly as she had turned toward them, she spun around and sprinted into the fog, disappearing as if she had never been there. Jack stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Had she been real? Was she another trick of the town? "I didn't like that," Mia said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." Without saying another word, Jack turned back toward the van, his steps quick and heavy. The others followed, but the air felt thick and heavy, pressing in on them. "Wait," Ben said, his voice soft but urgent. "Did you hear that?" Jack froze. He strained his ears, but all he could hear was the silence, the low hum of the van engine, and the whispering of the wind through the trees. But then, there it was again, a low, guttural sound, as if something was moving in the fog, something large. "We're not alone," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly turned, his eyes scanning the fog, looking for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Suddenly, a loud crash came from behind them, the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Mia screamed, her voice echoing through the fog, and Jack whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. The woman was back, but she wasn't alone. From the shadows of the fog, figures began to emerge, shapes that were barely visible, moving with unnatural speed and precision. There were too many to count. "Get in the van!" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse. He didn't wait for a response. He shoved the door open and jumped inside, his hands fumbling to start the engine. The others piled into the van, panic evident in their faces. But the engine didn't start. "Start! Damn it!" Jack growled, slamming his hands against the steering wheel. Outside, the figures were closing in, getting closer with every passing second. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the fog, and the whispers returned, louder now, surrounding them. Jack slammed the key into the ignition again, but the van refused to start. "I can't do this," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I can't stay here. Please, Jack, make it stop." Jack's heart raced, his mind a whirl of panic and fear. The figures were almost at the van now, their faces still hidden in the mist, but their presence was unmistakable. And then, just as the first figure reached the van, the engine roared to life. The van jerked forward, speeding down the road, the fog parting in front of them like a curtain. But the feeling of being hunted didn't go away. The van sped through the fog, the tires screeching as Jack pushed the pedal harder. His heart raced with every turn, every lurch of the wheel. The figures were behind them, he could feel it. They were still there, lurking just out of sight, following their every move. "What the hell just happened?" Ben gasped from the back seat, his voice shaking. He was clutching the armrest so tightly that his knuckles were white. Jack didn't answer him. He couldn't. His mind was too clouded with fear. He glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing, just thick, suffocating fog. But his gut told him something was wrong. They were being watched. "Are they following us?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack's grip tightened on the wheel. "I don't know, but I think so." The fog seemed endless, swirling around them like a living thing, pressing in on all sides. The road stretched out before them, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that it was leading them deeper into a trap. Clara was staring out the window, her face pale. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. She was muttering something under her breath, her eyes wide with panic. Jack had no time to ask her what was wrong. He needed to focus. "We need to stop. We need to figure out what's going on," he said, his voice tight. "We can't stop," Clara suddenly shouted, her voice frantic. "We can't stop here. If we stop, we'll never get out." "What do you mean?" Ben asked, his voice filled with confusion. Clara turned to him, her eyes wide with terror. "Don't you understand? This place is like a trap, a maze. It's pulling us in. If we stop, we'll never leave." Mia shuddered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "Then what do we do? Just keep driving forever?" "I don't know," Jack muttered, But we can't stay still. We can't let them catch up. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, but no matter how fast Jack drove, the fog never lifted. He could feel it closing in, suffocating the life out of him. His hands were slick with sweat, and his chest felt tight as though the air itself was too thick to breathe. He tried to push the thoughts away, tried to focus on the road ahead. But his mind kept drifting back to that woman, to the figures in the fog. Were they real? Or were they just figments of their imagination, created by the town's dark, twisted hold? Suddenly, the van jolted. The tires hit something, and the vehicle swerved violently to the left. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he fought to keep control. "Hold on!" Jack shouted as the van skidded across the wet road, barely missing a tree. He gritted his teeth, struggling to regain control of the wheel. The van finally slowed, coming to a shaky stop. Jack exhaled deeply, his hands trembling. He looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. "What was that?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jack said, his voice strained. He peered out the window, scanning the fog for any sign of what they had hit. There was nothing. "Let's just go," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Jack, let's just leave this place. I can't stay here anymore." Jack didn't argue. He started the engine again, his foot heavy on the gas. The van lurched forward, but the fog didn't relent. It seemed to follow them, like an unseen presence, keeping them trapped in this never-ending nightmare. Suddenly, the headlights caught something moving in the fog ahead. Jack slammed on the brakes again, the van screeching to a halt. His eyes locked onto the figure that stood in the middle of the road. It was the woman, the one from before, but now she wasn't alone. A group of people stood behind her, their faces hidden in the shadows. They were all dressed in ragged clothes, their movements stiff and jerky. Their eyes, like the woman's, were empty, hollow. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to turn the van around, to speed away as fast as he could, but something held him there. Something forced him to look. The woman stepped forward, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes said it all. "Come closer." Jack's blood ran cold. His fingers hovered over the gear shift, ready to drive away, but his body wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed by fear. "They're not real," Ben whispered from the back seat, his voice trembling. "They can't be real." But as he said the words, the figures moved, slowly, shuffling toward the van, their feet dragging on the pavement, their eyes fixed on them. "They're coming," Mia cried out, her voice cracking. "We have to go. We have to go now." Jack's foot slammed down on the gas, and the van lurched forward, speeding past the figures in the road. His heart was racing, and he couldn't focus on anything but the need to get out of there, away from them. The fog seemed to part as they sped through it, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the figures were still behind them, watching, waiting. "What the hell are they?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Jack replied, his voice hoarse. "But we need to get out of here. We need to find somewhere safe." But as they drove deeper into the fog, a sinking feeling began to settle in Jack's stomach. The road seemed to stretch on forever, but there were no signs of anything familiar. No landmarks, no turnoffs. It was as if the town had swallowed them whole. "They're following us," Ben said, his voice low, almost in a whisper. "Aren't they?" Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. He was too terrified to admit it, but he knew it was true. Whatever these things were, whatever had taken over this town, they weren't going to stop until they had them. And in that moment, Jack realized something else. They weren't just trapped in this town. They were being hunted. The van sped through the fog, the tires screeching as Jack pushed the pedal harder. His hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white with tension. Every second felt like an eternity. He glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing but the thick, suffocating fog. But his gut told him something was wrong. The shadows were still there. He could feel them. Are they gone? Ben's voice trembled from the back seat, his eyes wide with fear. Jack couldn't answer. His mind was racing. The woman and her followers. He couldn't shake the image of their hollow eyes, their slow, dragging movements. He tried to push the thought away, but it clung to him like the fog, suffocating him. "We have to find somewhere safe," Clara whispered. Her voice was hoarse, strained with fear. "Anywhere. Just get us out of here, Jack." "I'm trying," Jack muttered. "I'm trying." But the road ahead was endless. The fog never lifted. The van seemed to be moving in circles, as if they were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. His grip tightened on the wheel, the tension building in his chest. The cold, clammy sweat on his palms made it harder to keep control. Suddenly, the headlights flashed on something ahead. A figure, tall, thin, and barely visible through the fog. Jack slammed on the brakes, the van jerking to a stop. "Not again," Mia whispered, her voice shaky. She grabbed the seat, her fingers digging into the fabric. "Please, not again." The figure didn't move. It just stood there in the middle of the road, staring into the van. Jack's breath caught in his throat. His heart raced. He could feel the sweat dripping down his back. "Is it one of them?" Ben asked, his voice low, fearful. Jack didn't answer. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. It was a man, but his face was hidden in the shadows. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, like he was waiting for something. Jack's hand hovered over the gear shift, but he couldn't bring himself to move. He was trapped in place, paralyzed by fear. The figure was too still, too unnatural. "Jack," Clara whispered urgently. "We need to go. Don't stop." But it was too late. The man in the fog took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. And with each step, the temperature in the van seemed to drop. Jack could see his breath misting in the air. "Get moving!" Clara screamed, her voice breaking. "Drive! Now!" Jack's foot slammed down on the gas, the van lurching forward. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. He just pushed the pedal harder, the engine roaring as they sped past the figure. But the fog didn't fade. It didn't get any thinner. It felt like they were driving through an endless sea of mist, with no way out. "Are we being followed?" Ben asked, his voice small, scared. "Are they behind us?" Jack kept his eyes on the road, but he could feel it. He could feel the presence, the cold chill that pressed against him from all sides. The figures were there somewhere, waiting. "I don't know," Jack said, his voice tight, "but we need to keep moving. We can't stop." The van sped down the road, but the fog never relented. It seemed to stretch on forever, like a dark ocean that surrounded them on all sides. "Why won't it end?" Mia asked, her voice shaky. She sounded close to tears. "Why can't we get out of here?" Jack didn't have an answer. The road ahead was a blur, the fog swallowing everything in its path. They were moving, but it felt like they were going nowhere. A sudden crack echoed through the air, like something had snapped or someone had stepped on a branch. Jack's heart leaped into his throat. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. "What was that?" Ben cried out, his voice trembling. Jack's eyes darted around. He could see nothing but the fog. The van was now completely surrounded. The figures were there, close. He could feel them. He could hear the faint shuffling sounds, like footsteps dragging across the ground. "I think they're here," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. She was holding her breath, her eyes wide with fear. Then, without warning, the sound of tapping on the window pierced the silence. Tap, tap, tap. Jack's heart raced. He turned his head slowly, his eyes widening as he saw a pale, ghostly face pressed against the glass. The woman, she was back. Her eyes, empty, hollow, stared at him through the window. Her lips curled into a twisted smile. Tap, tap, tap. She wasn't alone. The figures were all around them now, pressing against the van. Jack could see their faces, faint, distorted images in the fog. They were closing in. Please, Mia sobbed. Please, Jack, don't let them get us. But Jack couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The weight of their presence was suffocating. They were trapped. Then the woman's hand reached out, slowly, deliberately, and placed it on the window. Bang! The window shattered. The force of the impact sent shards of glass flying into the van. Jack screamed, throwing himself backward, but the figures outside didn't move. They just stood there watching, waiting. Clara screamed, her voice high-pitched with terror. "We need to go. Now!" Jack didn't wait. He floored the gas pedal, the van lurching forward, but the fog didn't break. It only seemed to grow thicker. The figures, they were still there, looming just beyond the reach of the headlights. He couldn't stop now. He couldn't afford to. But deep down, Jack knew something worse than the fog was closing in. The van barreled through the fog, its headlights struggling to cut through the thick, suffocating mist. Jack's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his fingers began to ache. But he didn't dare loosen his grip. Behind them, the shadows were always there, just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. Clara, sitting next to him, was trembling, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. Ben was hunched over in the back, his hands clasped in front of his mouth, trying not to scream. Mia sat quietly, staring at the road ahead with a look of disbelief, as though she couldn't fathom what was happening. None of them spoke. They couldn't. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the sound of the tires skimming over the wet road. Jack kept his eyes straight ahead, forcing himself to focus, but the weight of the air, the pressure pressing in on all sides, was unbearable. It felt like the van was trapped in a never-ending loop, moving forward but getting nowhere. "Jack," Clara whispered after what felt like an eternity. "What if we can't get out of here? What if we're already trapped?" The thought sent a chill down Jack's spine. He glanced at her, but his words stuck in his throat. They had to keep going. There was no choice. "We'll get out," he said, though his voice sounded weak, even to himself. "We just have to keep moving." But as the minutes passed, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying to himself. The town, the people who had vanished, everything was wrong. It felt like they were already too far gone to turn back. The fog wasn't just outside. It was inside too, creeping into their minds, clouding their judgment, pulling them deeper into this nightmare. Suddenly, the van's headlights flickered. "Not now!" Jack shouted, slamming the wheel. "Please!" The headlights blinked once, then went out entirely. The world plunged into darkness. "Jack!" Clara cried. "What's happening?" Jack swore under his breath, his fingers flying over the dashboard, trying to find the right buttons to turn the lights back on. But nothing worked. The darkness was absolute. A heavy thud echoed through the van. Too close. A sound like something or someone was hitting the side of the vehicle. Jack's breath caught in his throat. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the van lurched violently to the side, as though something had just slammed into it. Everyone screamed, but Jack fought to keep control of the wheel, trying to steer the van back into the center of the road. The fog was so thick he could barely see an inch in front of the hood. Another thud. Then, the unmistakable sound of something scraping against metal, nails dragging slowly, deliberately, as if something or someone was trying to get inside. "Who's out there?" Ben shouted, his voice rising in panic. Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind raced, heart hammering in his chest as the scraping grew louder. It was coming from every side now, the walls of the van shaking as though something was pressing against them, trying to break through. "We have to get out of here," Clara yelled, her voice rising with terror. Jack's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The fog outside had thickened and the shadows, the figures, they were closing in. Tap, tap, tap. The unmistakable sound of nails against the glass came again. Closer this time. Jack felt his skin crawl. "Don't look," Mia whispered. "Don't look at them." But Jack couldn't help himself. He turned his head. There, pressed up against the window, was the face of the woman. Her pale, gaunt features were distorted by the fog, but her eyes, those eyes, hollow, empty. And then, just as before, her lips curled into that terrible, twisted smile. He jerked his head away, trying to focus on the road, but the van was shaking violently now, as if something was slamming against it from all sides. The engine sputtered, the dashboard lights flickering in and out. Jack's heart raced. "Please," Ben sobbed. "We have to stop. Please, don't stop," Clara screamed. "Whatever you do, don't stop." But it was too late. The van lurched to the side again, this time flipping over completely. Jack braced himself, throwing his arms up instinctively as the world spun. The last thing he saw before the world went black was the woman's face, pressed up against the shattered window, her smile wide and unblinking.